Imagine waking up tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
You grab your phone off the nightstand, and the very first thing you see is that the world is just fundamentally at war.
A total nightmare scenario.
Exactly. Global markets are in absolute free fall. You check the price of oil, and it has skyrocketed past literally any historical benchmark you can think of.
Right.
You turn on the news, and the world's most heavily armed superpowers are actively clashing on multiple fronts. I mean, we're talking missiles flying in the Middle East, aircraft carriers surging across oceans, critical energy infrastructure just going up in flames.
It's terrifying.
It really is.
Yeah.
But now I want you to imagine peeling back the curtain on all of that geopolitical theater and realizing something infinitely more disturbing.
Which is saying something.
Right. You look at the people supposedly in charge, the leaders of these superpowers, and you realize that no one is actually steering the ship.
Nobody at the wheel.
Nobody at all. There is no master plan. There's no grand multi-decade strategy playing out like some game of 4D chess. Instead, it is just this massive, highly destructive improvisation playing out in real time.
Yeah, that's the truly chilling part.
And that chaotic improvisation is directly affecting you. It's affecting your wallet, your safety, the entire global order. Have you ever wondered how the biggest geopolitical events that shape your reality actually unfold behind closed doors? Well, today we're going to show you exactly what that looks like.
It's a really sobering thought, honestly, because, as citizens, as observers, our default assumption is always that someone, somewhere in a situation room, knows exactly what they're doing.
We want to believe that.
We crave that reassurance. But the material we are diving into today challenges that assumption at its very core. It systematically dismantles the whole idea of the rational actor on the global stage.
And to really grasp the gravity of this, we need to establish exactly where we are in time for this deep dive. Today is March 7, 2026. For the past week, the news cycle has been an absolute blur of escalating violence. And to make sense of it, we are looking at this fascinating, highly classified style internal analytical document.
Yeah, it's a remarkable piece of analysis.
It really is. It comes from a group known as the Red Team Trading Community. And for those of you who might not be familiar with them, these aren't your typical cable news pundits.
Far from it.
This community is made up of high-level quants, geopolitical risk assessors, institutional analysts who trade massive amounts of capital based on real-world events.
They don't care about political spin.
They care about what is actually happening, because literally billions of dollars are on the line for them.
Exactly.
So the author of this specific document goes by the pseudonym Darwinian.
And the document itself is titled Multi-Hypothesis Analytical Framework, Operation Epic Fury Day 8 Plus Analysis.
Catchy title.
Very analytical. And we're looking specifically at version 8.1, which is crucial because it means this has been updated and refined in real time.
While the bombs have been falling.
Yeah, exactly. It's a dense, incredibly detailed 7-layer strategic framework. Darwinian is essentially attempting to map out the ongoing real-time war between the United States and Iran that kicked off just over a week ago, back on February 28th.
Right. Now, before we start pulling this massive document apart, I want to make the mission of this deep dive crystal clear for you listening right now.
Very important point here.
We are not here to pick sides. We're not here to endorse any political actions, whether left-wing, right-wing, domestic, or international. Our goal is strictly to impartially report on the content provided in this Red Team document.
We want to strip away the media framing.
Strip away the political rhetoric entirely and use Darwinian's multi-layered framework to map out exactly what is happening in this conflict. We're going to look at how it impacts you directly.
From your energy bills to the stability of your supply chains.
Yes. And most importantly, we're going to explore why the most dangerous element of this entire war isn't some diabolical master plan, but the terrifying absence of one. We are just here to convey the ideas and the analysis contained in the original source material.
And to do that effectively, we have to establish the ground rules that Darwinian sets out right in the foreword of the document.
What are those rules?
Well, the author states very clearly, hypotheses are tools, not conclusions.
Okay.
That is a critical discipline for you to keep in mind as we go through this. We are going to present 7 different hypotheses today. They are not mutually exclusive.
So we shouldn't be trying to, pick the winning theory.
Exactly. Don't look for the one right answer. Instead, think of them as describing different causal layers of the exact same conflict, all operating simultaneously.
Like layers of a cake.
Or a very chaotic onion. The discipline required here is to hold all 7 hypotheses in your mind in parallel without reducing them to a single, neat, easy-to-digest narrative.
Which is hard to do.
It is. The author's method is rigorous, though. You have to strip leader statements of their emotional rhetoric and read them purely as intent signals. Strip explosive events of their media framing and read them purely as data points.
Okay, I am so incredibly eager to unpack this. The level of detail here is staggering. Let's start by establishing the physical reality on the ground.
The baseline.
Right, what has actually happened from day 0 to day 8? We need to give you the baseline of chaos before we can analyze it.
So, day 0.
Operation Epic Fury begins on February 28th. The United States launches a massive decapitation strike.
And that strike kills Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Now, a decapitation strike isn't just a military maneuver.
No, it's the assassination of a sovereign state's ultimate political and religious authority.
Right. Instantly, the Iranian regime's survival mode is activated. Day 1, Iran retaliates by firing over 200 ballistic missiles, and the Strait of Hormuz
Which is the most critical oil choke point on the planet.
is de facto closed to commercial shipping.
The escalation from there is incredibly rapid. By days 2 and 3, the geographic footprint of the war expands. Gulf states are being targeted. Saudi Arabia's Aramco oil facilities are struck, and Qatari liquid natural gas LNG is halted.
Which is huge.
That single event takes 20% of the global LNG supply offline instantly. Think about what that does to global energy markets in a matter of hours.
It's pure panic. And then as we move through the week, the texture of the war kind of shifts. By day 4, the sheer volume of missile launches from Iran drops to single digits.
Which might look like a de-escalation to an untrained eye.
Exactly. But on that same day, an Iranian warship, the Aristine A, is sunk by a U.S. nuclear submarine. And Darwinian notes that this is the first confirmed submarine torpedo kill since World War II.
That is a massive historical threshold to cross.
Day 5, a Kurdish ground offensive begins in the region. Hezbollah becomes highly active on Israel's northern border, and this bizarre, massive diplomatic feud erupts between Spain and the U.S. administration.
Which brings us to days 7 and 8, the present moment of this version 8.1 update. We see a massive phase transition in the conflict here.
How so?
The targeting has shifted away from purely military installations to bilateral attacks on critical civilian-sustaining energy infrastructure.
Going after the power.
Yes. The U.S. and Israel strike Tehran oil depots for the first time. Iran retaliates by penetrating Israeli airspace and hitting the Haifa refinery.
Which we'll talk more about later because that is a huge deal.
It really is. And in response to that vulnerability, Israel proactively shuts down its massive Leviathan and Kurish offshore gas platforms.
Which supplies 70% of their national electricity.
Right. Meanwhile, the U.S. announces a third aircraft carrier is heading to the theater.
It is a dizzying amount of violence and economic disruption compressed into just 8 days. Which brings us to the foundation of Darwinian's entire document, Hypothesis 0.
The null hypothesis.
The null hypothesis. The author argues that this is the baseline default condition against which all the other complex theories must be tested.
And the core claim of Hypothesis 0 is beautifully simple and deeply alarming.
No grand design.
No grand design. To anchor this concept, the document relies on a famous principle from the 19th century Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz.
Right, Clausewitz.
Clausewitz wrote, "No one starts a war, or rather, no one in his senses ought to do so, without first being clear in his mind what he intends to achieve by that war and how he intends to conduct it."
Seems like pretty basic advice.
The author emphasizes that Clausewitz isn't offering some high-minded philosophical commentary here. He is stating the bare minimum requirement of common sense before deploying lethal force.
You don't need to be a strategic genius to start a war, but you do need a baseline of rationality. You need an end state in mind.
Exactly. But the document argues that absolutely none of the actors in this conflict meet that baseline of rationality.
Which is wild to think about. Because as humans, we naturally want to assume there is a grand design. When things are chaotic, we comfort ourselves by imagining a smoky back room where brilliant strategists are pulling the strings.
We want to believe that the leadership in Iran is executing a master architectural plan.
Or that the U.S. military has this sophisticated multi-phase roadmap. But the data from day 7 completely falsifies all of that.
It does. Let's look at the U.S. administration, which Darwinian refers to throughout the document as ain'ts.
Right, ain'ts. Now, that naming convention might seem unusual to some listeners, but it's highly intentional. I was actually going to ask you about that. Ain'ts isn't a typical geopolitical moniker. Where does that come from?
It's a fascinating cultural reference that perfectly encapsulates the author's point. Ainz refers to Ainz Ulgaun, the main character of a popular anime and light novel series called Overlords.
Okay, an anime reference in a highly classified style financial document.
Yes, in that story, Ainz is this supreme, godlike, skeletal ruler. All of his subordinates believe he is a flawless, 10,000 IQ strategic genius operating on a level they can't even comprehend.
But that's not the reality.
The internal reality of the character is that he is just an ordinary, highly anxious guy who has absolute no idea what he's doing. He is constantly improvising, panicking internally, and just bluffing his way through crises.
Well, his followers mistakenly interpret his random actions as parts of a brilliant master plan.
Exactly. By labeling the U.S. administration Eins, Darwinian is telling the reader, stop looking for the master plan. The awe-inspiring military power is real, just like the anime character, but the strategic mind directing it is completely hollow.
That is an incredible analogy.
Yeah.
And it makes the data points so much more terrifying. Because if you look at what Ainz, the U.S. administration, did within just 7 days,
That's a lot.
they start a massive war with Iran. They publicly demand an unconditional surrender with no defined terms whatsoever. They casually announce an upcoming regime change operation in Cuba.
Out of nowhere.
I don't know where. And then they hint at unsanctioning Russian oil. All of this happens within 1 week. There is no narrative coherence. There is no documented exit strategy. It is pure reactive improvisation.
Exactly. The driving force here isn't grand strategy, it is institutional survival. Right. If we break down the true motives of the major global actors according to the text, we see multiple entities acting purely on short-term impulses.
Survival instincts.
The document assesses that the actions of Ainz are primarily driven by domestic approval ratings, managing the relentless 24-hour news cycle, the electoral calendar, and an obsession with personal legacy.
Long-term U.S. strategic interests are entirely secondary.
And it is the same story on the other side. Look at the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. We think of them as the military arm of the state, but their survival interest isn't necessarily protecting the civilian population of Iran.
Right, they have their own empire.
The IRGC operates a massive multi-billion-dollar shadow economy. They control construction, energy smuggling, telecommunications. Their primary motive is protecting that institutional wealth.
And maintaining their independence from any civilian Iranian government that might try to rein them in.
Precisely. And we can extend this framework to the other global superpowers who are circling this conflict. Look at Russia's Vladimir Putin.
What are his drivers?
Regime survival, a deep-seated fear of a Western-backed color revolution in Moscow, and personal control. This is the exact same survival-driven logic that caused him to launch the Ukraine war without a clear, achievable endgame.
Which fundamentally degraded his own military deterrence.
Or look at China. The Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping are driven by regime survival and the constant need to manage extreme domestic nationalist pressure.
Right. For them, the issue of Taiwan isn't necessarily about territorial expansion. Taiwan is an instrument used to maintain domestic legitimacy.
Darwinian perfectly encapsulates this entire dynamic with a phrase that genuinely gave me chills. This is Thucydides without Pericles. All actors have power, none have wisdom.
Wow. Every single player on the board has the military capacity to destroy the world, but not a single one of them is acting based on what is best for their country's long-term stability.
To really drive this home, the author contrasts the current situation with the 1990 Gulf War in Kuwait.
Okay, let's compare.
In 1990, the U.S. military under General Norman Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell had an actual, tangible plan. They had a designed 100-hour ground campaign,
Explicitly defined objectives regarding the liberation of Kuwait.
and clear victory conditions that allowed them to stop fighting. A grand design can be negotiated. A grand design has structured exit ramps. Most importantly, a grand design has a floor limit to how far things will escalate.
And what Darwinian is warning us about in Hypothesis Zero is that improvisation has no floor.
No floor at all.
The most dangerous scenario in global geopolitics isn't an evil mastermind with a meticulous plan. The most dangerous scenario is impulsive leaders with immense firepower, interacting with a chaotic situation that has spiraled utterly beyond their comprehension.
And none of them possess the mechanisms to stop the dynamic they themselves created.
So if there really is no master plan, and everyone is just improvising and hoping for the best, what happens when that improvisation hits the cold, hard reality of military logistics?
The math.
Because as I was looking at the math in body section 2 of this document, and frankly, it's terrifying. Let's explore Hypothesis B, military attrition, and Hypothesis F, the invincibility myth under test.
Hypothesis B removes all the political rhetoric and looks strictly at the battlefield arithmetic. It argues that physical depletion, not strategic restraint or diplomatic breakthroughs, is what will ultimately determine the trajectory of this war.
The document breaks down the munition numbers, and they are incredibly stark.
Prior to the February 28th strikes, Western intelligence estimated Iran had roughly 1,200 to 2,000 ballistic missiles. By day 6, after massive volleys and U.S. preemptive strikes, they are estimated to have between 730 and 1,530 remaining.
But Garwinian points out that the missiles themselves aren't the actual binding constraint for Iran.
Right, it's the launchers, the Mobile Tells Transporter Erector launchers.
These are the massive specialized trucks required to actually fire the heavy ballistic missiles. The intelligence suggests Iran started with about 200 of these TLs.
By day 6, due to intense U.S. targeting, they are estimated to only have 50 to 80 remaining.
So the U.S. military campaign was specifically designed to hunt down and destroy these physical launchers before the U.S. runs out of interceptor missiles to defend against them.
And to a certain degree, that tactical hunting mission is working. But that leads us to the critical asymmetry of this conflict. While the U.S. is hunting launchers, they are bleeding their most advanced defensive
The
assets.
shield is cracking.
The United States is relying heavily on the TA System Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense. These are incredibly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar interceptors designed to knock ballistic missiles out of the sky.
Right.
Post-June 2025, the U.S. had a global stockpile of roughly 390 THEAD interceptors. By day 6 of this conflict, they have burned through so many that the stockpile is estimated to be down to just 210 to 240 remaining.
And here's where the math just breaks my brain. The Center for Strategic and International Studies CSIS models this exact scenario. The U.S. is firing these interceptors at a burn rate of roughly 30 per day.
30 a day.
But the defense industrial base can only produce new ones at a replenishment rate of 0.1 per day. Wait, let me make sure I'm fully grasping this because those numbers are insane.
They are.
We are shooting 30 of these advanced missiles every single day, but our factories can only build one new missile every 10 days.
That is the reality.
That isn't just a bottleneck, that is a mathematical cliff. You don't need a degree in logistics to see where that ends up.
CSIS models that the entire U.S. defensive shield reaches a point of systemic degradation by day 30.
Day 30.
And it gets worse because Iran isn't just firing ballistic missiles that require a THAAD intercept. They are swarming the airspace with thousands of Shahed drones.
This is where the economics of modern warfare become deeply problematic. A Shahed drone is essentially a flying lawnmower.
Built with fiberglass, a cheap commercial moped engine, and basic GPS.
It costs maybe $50,000 to manufacture, but you still have to shoot it down if it's heading for a command center.
So you have situations where a $4 million U.S. interceptor is being fired to destroy a $50,000 drone. It is an invisible, massive drain on U.S. resources.
Which introduces a concept that Darwinian calls the deterrence capital account. I think this is one of the most vital takeaways for anyone trying to understand the global stakes here.
Absolutely.
Explain how this Middle Eastern war is affecting the U.S. posture globally, specifically regarding the Pacific.
The deterrence capital account is the idea that military power is a finite bank account. Every time you spend it in one place, you cannot spend it somewhere else.
Makes sense.
The U.S. military is designed to project power globally, with a massive focus on deterring a potential Chinese move against Taiwan. But the munitions being used in Iran are the exact same munitions required for a Pacific contingency.
Every $4 million interceptor fired at a cheap drone over the Arabian Sea is one less interceptor available to defend Taiwan.
Every radar system that gets damaged in Jordan is one less sensor monitoring the Pacific theater. Every month that an aircraft carrier strike group is committed to the Middle East is a month. It cannot be rotated into the Western Pacific to project strength.
Darwinian is arguing that this war of attrition in the Middle East is effectively bankrupting the United States Pacific deterrent.
Precisely.
So we are systematically depleting our shield against a major superpower to fight a localized desert war. And that leads perfectly into Hypothesis F, the invincibility myth under test.
The document suggests that the global perception of U.S. conventional military invincibility isn't a hard, immutable law of physics. It's a carefully constructed narrative.
It was built on highly publicized, cherry-picked victories like the 1991 Gulf War, where the U.S. decimated the Iraqi army.
Or the 1999 Kosovo air campaign. Meanwhile, the messy, systemic failures like the quagmire in Vietnam or the chaotic 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan are treated as political anomalies rather than military limitations.
But right now, in real time, that myth of technological invincibility is being tested, and it is eroding live on social media for the entire world to see.
The Day 7 and Day 8 confirmations of this erosion are not theoretical. They are highly visible data points. The document details that a U.S. odd radar system, the very eyes of that advanced missile shield at the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, was struck and apparently destroyed.
2 separate locations in the UAE housing THAAD radar systems were hit.
An early warning radar installation in Qatar was damaged. The U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, which is the nerve center for regional naval operations, was targeted multiple times.
6 U.S. service members were tragically killed in a single strike in Kuwait. The precision defense layer, the supposed impenetrable dome of Western technology, is visibly cracking.
And then Day 8 happens, and we see the most glaring proof of this. An Iranian Khyber-Shikan ballistic missile manages to completely penetrate the layered defenses of Israel.
You're talking about the Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Arrow system, arguably the most dense, sophisticated air defense network on the planet.
And the Iranian missile slips through all of it and strikes the Haifa refinery.
That is one of the most heavily defended critical infrastructure locations in the entire country. But it's not just the strike itself, it's the reaction to the strike that Darwinian highlights as crucial.
Following that penetration, Israel makes the proactive decision to shut down its Leviathan and Karish offshore gas platforms.
But that is a staggering economic decision.
To put that in context, those platforms supply 70% of Israel's national electricity grid.
Wow.
You do not proactively turn off the power source for your entire modern economy, plunging industries into darkness, if you are confident that your interceptor layer can defend those assets.
The fact that they shut them down is an open admission to the world that their intercept capacity is degraded.
They knew they couldn't stop the next missile.
Darwinian makes a really compelling historical comparison here. The author argues that we need to look at Russia's catastrophic blunder in Ukraine to truly understand what the U.S. is accidentally doing to itself right now in Iran.
It's an essential mirror. Think back to the start of the Ukraine conflict. Russia went in expecting a lightning-fast 72-hour victory parade in Kiev.
Instead, they got bogged down in a grinding, asymmetric war of attrition where $500 Ukrainian drones were destroying $4 million Russian tanks.
The massive hardware exposure, the domestic political feedback loops, the sheer inability to exit the conflict without suffering a humiliating loss of face, it all worked together to completely shatter the global perception of Russian military might.
And the incredible irony of that situation is that Russia destroying its own deterrence in Ukraine is exactly what gave the U.S. administration the geopolitical permission slip to start acting aggressively in the Western Hemisphere.
Over the last 60 days, the U.S. has targeted Venezuela and announced regime change in Cuba. Why? Because Russia, the traditional historical guarantor of those nations, is completely stuck in the mud in Ukraine and cannot project power to stop the U.S.
But now, Darwinian argues, the U.S. is mirroring that exact same arrogant blunder in Iran.
Precisely. By allowing themselves to be bled dry in a Middle Eastern war of attrition, by exposing the limits of their THAAD systems and burning through their interceptor stockpiles, the U.S. is actively destroying its own aura of invincibility.
In doing so, they're accidentally kicking the door wide open for China in the Taiwan Strait. This dynamic introduces what the text profoundly labels the Taiwan paradox.
This part of the document completely reframed how I think about the Pacific. The common everyday assumption we all hear is that China is a coiled spring, just waiting for the perfect moment of U.S. distraction to launch a massive amphibious invasion of Taiwan.
But Darwinian argues the exact opposite. The author claims that Xi Jinping actually does not want to invade Taiwan. In fact, the unresolved status of Taiwan is far more valuable to the Chinese Communist Party than actually conquering it.
The author provides 5 specific structural reasons for this paradox, and they are incredibly persuasive. First, the unresolved status of Taiwan acts as a massive domestic legitimacy engine for the CCP.
The narrative of the unfinished business of the Civil War and the eventual goal of reunification keeps domestic nationalist fervor burning bright.
It is the perfect tool to distract the Chinese population from a slowing economy and a bursting real estate bubble. Second, actually invading Taiwan destroys the ultimate prize, the TSMC semiconductor fabrication plants.
Right, and we have to pause on TSMC because it's so vital. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company produces the vast majority of the world's most advanced microchips.
Sure.
Everything from your smartphone to an F-35 fighter jet relies on them.
And TSMC has a publicly known poison pill protocol. If China invades, the factories are designed to be sabotaged and bricked. The sensitive equipment will be destroyed before the PLA can secure it.
China wants the chips and the economic engine. They do not want a smoking crater of useless silicon.
Exactly. Third, the One China policy is an unparalleled tool of global diplomatic leverage. Currently, around 180 countries have to formally acknowledge Beijing's position on Taiwan just to be allowed to do business with the Chinese market.
It forces countries to pay diplomatic tribute.
If Taiwan is conquered and the issue is resolved, Beijing loses that leverage over the international community. Fourth, the current geopolitical tension forces the U.S. to trap 2 to 3 massive carrier strike groups in the Pacific at all times.
It is a strategic sinkhole for the U.S. Navy.
If the Taiwan issue disappears, the U.S. can suddenly redirect that massive naval power anywhere else in the world. And fifth, the constant, low-simmering threat of a Taiwan conflict is the primary justification the CCP uses for the massive $225 billion budget of the People's Liberation Army.
So when you look at those 5 reasons, ambiguity is China's most valuable strategic product. China is actually safest, and Xi Jinping is most comfortable when the myth of U.S. military invincibility is fully intact.
Because that U.S. threat gives Xi the perfect, unassailable excuse to tell the aggressive hardline generals in his own military, the time isn't right yet, America's too strong, we must be patient.
But if the U.S. invincibility myth collapses in the deserts of Iran, if the global audience sees that the U.S. military has a very real mathematical ceiling and runs out of missiles in 30 days, Xi loses that vital excuse.
That is the terror of the paradox. The domestic pressure from Chinese hardliners who see American weakness might become uncontainable. Xi could be pushed into launching an invasion he doesn't actually want, simply to maintain his grip on power.
The ultimate devastating irony here is that the U.S. starting an improvised war in Iran could forcefully trigger a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, an action that is against both U.S. and Chinese strategic interests, simply because no one at the N's administration possessed a grand design to anticipate this chain reaction.
It is a terrifying slow-motion domino effect. So if the U.S. military is bleeding its deterrence capital, the interceptor math is disastrous, and the war is mathematically unwinnable in a clean sense by day 30, a logical person has to ask, why hasn't a ceasefire been negotiated?
Right? Why hasn't someone picked up a phone?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at who is actually waiting on the other side of that phone call. Let's delve into the Iranian power struggle and what the document calls the bilateral failure mode.
This brings us to Hypothesis A. This layer operates entirely within the labyrinth of Iranian domestic politics. The core claim of Hypothesis A is that this war, from the Iranian perspective, is no longer primarily about fighting the United States.
It has transformed into a brutal instrument for internal power consolidation in the vacuum created by Khamenei's death. The key figure the document focuses on is Ali Larijani.
Darwinian suggests that Larijani is not just a passive beneficiary of the decapitation strike. He is the most capable, well-positioned political operator attempting to seize control of the state apparatus.
The timeline Darwinian provides for this power shift is fascinating. It didn't just start on February 28th. The groundwork was laid months prior. In June 2025, Khamenei retreats to a secure bunker amid rising regional tensions.
By September 2025, his public communications drop off significantly, and Larijani essentially steps into the void, becoming the de facto acting authority for day-to-day governance.
Then the decapitation strike happens on day 0. Khamenei is killed. Larijani's authority is immediately formalized via an interim leadership council. And what does he do with that power? He immediately initiates a highly sophisticated dual-track strategy.
Publicly, for the domestic audience, it is all fire and brimstone, defiance. We will avenge the supreme leader. We will never negotiate with the great Satan.
But privately, in the shadows, he is immediately spinning up diplomatic back channels in Muscat, Oman, and Doha, Qatar.
And he has a proven history of operating exactly like this. Larijani was an instrumental architect behind the scenes of the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, using the exact same dual-track playbook.
But Darwinian identifies a massive analytical blind spot. You cannot accurately model Larijani as the sole unified voice of the Iranian state. Iran's governmental structure is intentionally fractured.
The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is effectively a state within a state. As we discussed earlier, they operate a shadow economy, worth an estimated $1 trillion.
They handle the complex logistics of sanctions arbitrage, they win the massive state construction contracts, they control the borders, they possess institutional survival interests that operate completely independently of any civilian government sitting in Tehran.
Historically, whenever a civilian faction attempts to negotiate a diplomatic thaw with the West that might open up the economy and threaten their monopoly, the IRGC acts as a militant spoiler.
Larijani can sit in Doha and negotiate a brilliant ceasefire, but the IRGC generals can sabotage it instantly by launching a volley of missiles if they don't like the terms.
And this structural chaos brings us to what the author calls the rational counterpart problem, or the bilateral failure mode. Consider the mechanics of diplomacy. It's one thing to run a sophisticated back-channel negotiation if the person on the other side of the table is a rational actor capable of accepting the off-ramp.
During the 2015 JCPOA negotiations, Larijani was dealing with the Obama administration. Whatever you think of their politics, that was an administration with a clearly designed end state, a unified negotiating team, and a fully staffed, functioning State Department.
But today, Larijani is dealing with ain'ts, an administration with no designed end state. Furthermore, the U.S. State Department is literally missing 8,000 vital employees right now due to a massive ongoing Department of Homeland Security government shutdown.
There is no unified decision-maker on the U.S. side capable of analyzing a complex signal and just saying yes.
The document provides a stunning real-time confirmation of this bilateral failure mode happening on day 8. It involves Iran's civilian president, Masoud Pezeshkian.
On March 7th, Pezeshkian issues a very public, highly unusual apology statement. In the nuanced language of diplomacy, this is a glaring signal. He is likely trying to communicate to the international community a desire for de-escalation.
But within hours, literally the same day, the IRGC publicly rebukes their own president. A military commander goes on state television and tells the world to ignore Pezeshkian's words during the war.
This extraordinary moment publicly exposes that the civilian Iranian president does not have operational control over his own military forces.
It's like a company where the CEO is desperately trying to negotiate a merger, and the factory floor managers are actively setting fire to the building.
And the U.S. response to this delicate, fractured dynamic, it's the exact opposite of nuanced statecraft.
Instead of quietly recognizing the massive internal rift in Iran, catching the olive branch, and working the back channels to widen that division, the Aints administration blunders forward.
They publicly frame Pezeshkian's apology as an unconditional surrender by the entire Iranian state and use it to threaten further military escalation.
They exploit a fragile diplomatic signal for cheap domestic political points rather than receiving it as a genuine opening for peace.
It is a profound tragedy of structural mismatch. Darwinian paints this vivid picture of Larijani desperately trying to build a diplomatic bridge over a chasm, but he is building it from an Iranian shoreline that has two violently conflicting governments, the civilian moderates and the hardline military, towards a U.S. shoreline that has zero coherent governments.
Just a chaotic collection of competing political factions fighting for the microphone.
And to add the ultimate layer of tragic irony to this entire situation, consider the decapitation strike on day 0. The U.S. spent immense resources to locate and kill Ayatollah Khamenei.
But Khamenei was the only man in the entire Iranian ecosystem who possessed the ultimate unquestionable religious and constitutional authority to order the IRGC generals to stop firing.
By achieving their tactical goal of killing him, the U.S. military destroyed the only strategic mechanism that existed for a clean diplomatic exit.
That is just unbelievable when you say it out loud. You execute a flawless military strike to kill the only guy who actually has the authority to sign the peace treaty.
It's the definition of a Pyrrhic victory.
So while Washington and Tehran are completely fumbling in the dark, incapable of finding an off-ramp, the real economic shockwaves of this war are hitting a continent that didn't even realize it was the primary target.
Europe.
This leads us into the massive global implications outlined in Section 4. We need to unpack European coercion, the grand energy restructuring, and what the document calls the Qatar Masterclass.
This section is incredibly complex because it requires us to view 3 hypotheses simultaneously. Let's start with Hypothesis C, the grand energy restructuring.
The prevailing theory in many policy circles is that the U.S. strikes on Venezuela earlier in the year, followed by the war in Iran, were part of a coordinated grand design to cut off cheap oil supplies to China and restructure global supply chains in America's favor.
But Darwinian points out exactly where this theory breaks down upon contact with reality. China simply isn't structurally dependent on Iranian or Venezuelan oil for its survival.
They buy it because it's heavily sanctioned, and therefore trades at a massive discount. It's cheap arbitrage. Furthermore, Chinese intelligence clearly anticipated a disruption.
They had proactively pre-positioned a massive 166 million barrel buffer of Iranian oil on tankers floating in Asian waters before the war even started.
And on a macro level, China's aggressive, massive adoption of domestic electric vehicles is structurally reducing their total national oil demand every single year anyway.
Right, so if the Grand Master Plan of the U.S. was to squeeze China's energy throat, it completely failed. China is essentially insulated from this specific shock.
Which leads Darwinian to propose Hypothesis D, the European coercion architecture. If China isn't the victim of the energy shock, who is? The real transmission layer of this massive market disruption is Europe.
The author argues a very provocative point. Europe is not a spectator in this Middle Eastern war, and they are not a co-aggressor alongside the U.S. Europe is the target of coercion.
The U.S. is intentionally using the chaos of this conflict to force Europe into absolute energy dependence on American LNG exports, force them to dramatically increase their NATO defense spending, and force them to align their trade policies purely with Washington's interests.
And the document provides a brilliant, data-driven breakdown of how European geopolitical courage correlates directly and almost exclusively with a nation's energy independence. Let's look at the fragmentation of the European alliance. When the bombs started falling, Germany's leader immediately flew to Washington in an act of total diplomatic submission.
Why? Because Germany's industrial base was already crippled by the loss of cheap Russian gas, and they simply cannot afford to alienate the U.S. while the Ukraine war is ongoing.
Then you have the UK performing what the author calls semantic gymnastics.
The UK government publicly calls the U.S. strikes illegal, trying to appease their domestic anti-war voters, but quietly allows the U.S. military to use British bases in Cyprus for what they label defensive operations.
But the real contrast that Darwinian highlights is between Italy and Spain. Let's look at Italy. Italy has come out fully, explicitly supporting the U.S.-Israeli war effort. They are enthusiastically waving the flag.
Why? Is it a deep moral conviction? No. It's because 45% of Italy's entire liquid natural gas supply comes directly from Qatar.
And as we mentioned earlier, Qatari LNG shipments are currently offline due to the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. Italy literally cannot afford to resist Washington because they are staring down the barrel of an immediate catastrophic energy collapse. Their strategic reserves were half empty going into this crisis. They have to comply.
But then look at the outlier. Look at Spain. Since day one of this conflict, Spain has maintained a consistent, unwavering forward policy, no to the war.
They flat out refused U.S. requests to use their critical military bases at Rota and Meran for any offensive operations. Why is Spain so brave when Germany and Italy are capitulating?
As the author notes, it is not because Spanish politicians possess some superior moral fiber. It is purely structural. Spain has spent the last decade building a highly diversified energy profile.
They have massive functional investments in domestic renewable energy, wind and solar.
Crucially, they have very low reliance on Qatari gas. Because their lights will stay on regardless of what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, they have the structural freedom to say no to the American superpower.
It is entirely transactional. Courage is just a byproduct of solar panels.
Which brings us to the absolute wildest part of this energy section. Hypothesis E, the undeclared broker. We need to talk about Qatar, because Qatar isn't just sitting there in the Gulf as a passive, helpless victim, while its vital shipping lanes are blocked by Iranian mines and U.S. warships.
They are actively using the chaos of the commodity markets as a weapon to force their way to the diplomatic table.
The document outlines what it calls Qatar's two-statement architecture. It is an absolute masterclass in using market manipulation as a tool of high-stakes diplomacy. Here is how it works.
Move 1. Qatar issues an official confirmed statement that they have halted all LNG production. This is stated in the past tense. It is a real physical action.
Instantly, 20% of the global LNG supply drops off the map. European gas futures spike by 50% in a matter of hours.
By doing this, Qatar establishes absolute terrifying credibility. They prove to the world, and specifically to Europe, that they have the power to inflict massive economic pain.
All right, they show the gun. And then comes move 2. Having established that credibility, Qatari officials casually issue a conditional, unconfirmed statement to the press. They merely hint that the broader coalition of Gulf states could potentially halt their oil production in solidarity.
Now let's look at the fundamentals. Qatar is a gas giant. They are not a major oil producer. From a purely fundamental market standpoint, a Qatari official hinting about oil shouldn't move the needle that much.
But the global oil markets instantly spiked to astronomical levels.
Wow.
Why? Because the market isn't pricing in the loss of Qatari oil. The market is pricing in the terrifying signal that the Gulf states might actually coordinate a 1970s-style oil embargo.
Exactly. Qatar effectively used the hard credibility earned in Move 1 to amplify the psychological impact of Move 2 far beyond their actual fundamental market share.
The implicit message Qatar is sending to Washington, to London, to Beijing is loud and clear. We can move the global LNG market in 24 hours. We can hint at an oil embargo and make your inflation numbers spike. Now that everyone sees the economic weapons we possess, let's all sit down at the table and talk about a ceasefire.
They're using the global commodity markets as their primary diplomatic bullhorn, demanding to be recognized as the indispensable mediator.
And Darwinian highlights a hidden structural constraint here that is vastly underreported in mainstream analysis. Why doesn't CALI just ally completely with the U.S., join a coalition, and help crush Iran once and for all?
It all comes down to geology. The North Pars and South Pars gas field. Qatar and Iran share the largest natural gas reservoir on the entire planet. What Qatar calls the North Dome is exactly the same geological formation that Iran calls South Pars.
It is one massive, continuous field divided only by an invisible maritime border. If the Iranian state completely collapses, if it descends into warlordism and chaos, Qatar loses the legal framework, the boundary agreements, and the functional state counterparty required to safely exploit that shared reservoir.
Therefore, the survival of the Iranian state is a matter of existential economic security for Qatar. They need Iran to survive as a functioning, coherent entity.
They certainly don't want Iran to become a dominant regional hegemon and win the war, but they absolutely cannot afford for Iran to be totally dismantled.
This deep, structural alignment of geological interest dictates Qatar's role as a mediator. They are stepping in to broker a peace, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but to protect their multi-trillion-dollar golden goose beneath the seafloor.
It's just incredible how interconnected it all is. The U.S. creates a massive global energy crisis to squeeze Europe into compliance and punish Iran, and Qatar swoops in, masters the chaos, cements its geopolitical power, and reaps the immense financial rewards of the spiked energy prices.
Which leads us to the final and perhaps most surreal section of our deep dive.
What happens when the architect of the chaos realizes the burning building is actually collapsing on top of them? Let's dive into Section 5, the Russian reversal and the Aints model of pathological leadership.
To understand the sheer absurdity of Day 7, we have to talk about the Russian variable. In the early days of this conflict, Darwinian categorized Russia simply as a passive beneficiary or a free rider.
If global oil prices go up because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, Russia simply makes more money on its own exports.
If Western theory interceptors are being rapidly depleted in the Middle East, that means fewer air defenses are being shipped to Ukraine. Russia just had to sit back, watch the fireworks, and reap the benefits.
But by Day 7, the dynamic fundamentally alters. Russia transitions from a passive free rider to an absolutely indispensable player in America's crisis management.
The geopolitical whiplash here is enough to snap your neck. Think about this deeply for a second. For 3 solid years, from 2022 to 2025, the United States and its European allies spent billions of dollars and immense diplomatic capital building a massive, highly complex sanctions architecture.
The entire goal was to isolate Russian energy from the global market to punish Putin for the war in Ukraine. They blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, they sanctioned dark fleets of oil tankers, they bullied neutral countries into compliance.
Fast forward to Day 6 of the Iran War, March 5th, 2026. The U.S. Treasury quietly issues a 30-day waiver, letting India buy Russian oil without penalty. That was a crack in the dam.
But that was just the appetizer.
Right. The real shock comes on Day 7, March 6th. The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, goes on Fox Business, a major domestic television network, and publicly announces that the United States may formally unsanction hundreds of millions of barrels of Russian oil.
He explicitly states that the administration will keep a cadence of announcing measures to bring relief to the market. The U.S. administration walked right up to Vladimir Putin's door, knocked, and asked for help.
They are actively, publicly dismantling a 3-year global sanctions architecture in the span of 48 hours because they desperately need Russian oil to flood the market and fill the massive supply gap they created by starting a war with Iran.
It's basically the geopolitical equivalent of intentionally burning down your own house, panicking when the fire gets too hot, and then having to knock on the door of the neighbor you've been aggressively suing for 3 years to ask if you can borrow their garden hose.
The U.S. is literally asking Russia to save them from a crisis the U.S. started. It's mind-boggling. And this perfectly illustrates Darwinian's final overarching framework, Hypothesis G, the Aints model.
This is the synthesis of the entire document. The core claim here is that the horrific consequences of this war are not driven by a master plan, but by a profound decision-making pathology at the highest levels of government.
It is a massive leadership void at the center, which is then aggressively filled by opportunistic subactors. The document calls these subactors demiurges, each pushing their own competing destructive agendas.
Darwinian provides a fascinating detailed mapping of these demiurges and how they operate within that leadership void. First, you have Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
He exploits the void. He pushes for the maximum permanent military incapacitation of Iran's striking refineries, pushing for regime change, because he knows there is no coherent U.S. strategy or strong leadership capable of restraining him.
Then you have U.S. Senator Marco Rubio. He fills the narrative void. He goes on television and frames the chaotic violence as a noble crusade for democracy promotion, applying a righteous ideological gloss to a war of attrition, even when that framing completely contradicts the reality on the ground.
Then you have figures like Caroline Leavitt, a prominent administration spokesperson. She decorates the void. Her role is to literally spin lies to the press corps, like aggressively claiming that Spain reversed its anti-war stance, forcing the Spanish government in Madrid to issue furious public denials.
And then you have Besant, the Treasury Secretary, who the document chillingly refers to as Pandora's actor. He instrumentalizes the void. He uses the sheer panic and chaos of the Iran war as political cover to execute the unthinkable, undoing the Russian sanctions.
If the U.S. had coherent, principled leadership, suddenly reversing sanctions on Russia while they are still fighting in Ukraine would be seen as a historic capitulation.
But in a chaotic void where gas prices are skyrocketing and the public is panicking, Besant can frame this massive geopolitical concession as a pragmatic, necessary emergency measure to save the American economy.
And we must recognize that the American economy desperately needs saving. This is the macro pressure cooking this whole situation and forcing the administration's hand. On day 7, 3 massive, disastrous data points converge simultaneously.
First, a catastrophic U.S. jobs report is released. The economy unexpectedly shed 92,000 jobs, and unemployment is ticking upward.
Second, the administration is managing an ongoing 22-day shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. This means TSA walkouts at airports are looming, and as we discussed, the State Department is paralyzed, missing thousands of workers.
Third, the military logistics network is stretched to the absolute breaking point, with a rare 3 aircraft carriers deployed simultaneously to one theater, burning millions of dollars a day. Oh, and amidst all of this collapsing infrastructure, the administration casually announces to the press that Cuba is their next target for an aggressive regime change operation.
It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible amount of pressure for any government to handle. And how does Aints react to this pressure? The author highlights the Spain episode to show this leadership pathology in real-time action.
When Spain asserts its sovereignty and says no to the war, the administration doesn't use diplomacy. They immediately threaten to cut all trade with Spain.
They completely ignore the basic geopolitical reality that Spain is a member of the European Union, meaning you cannot sanction Spain without sanctioning all 27 member states, effectively starting a trade war with your own allies.
Then, as we mentioned, Leavitt lies to the press and says Spain changed its mind. When Madrid issues a furious public denial of that lie, the administration doubles down. Aints gets in front of a microphone and publicly claims that the U.S. could just fly in and use the Spanish military bases anyway, boldly stating, nobody's going to tell us not to use it.
That specific statement about the Spanish bases is arguably the most dangerous sentence uttered by any leader in the entire conflict. By publicly stating that the United States feels entitled to ignore the territorial sovereignty of a NATO ally if that ally refuses to comply with U.S. demands, the administration effectively shattered the strategic ambiguity of NATO's Article 5.
They broadcasted a clear message to every single ally around the globe. American respect for mutual defense and national sovereignty is not a principle. It is purely conditional on your total, unquestioning submission to Washington's demands. No diplomatic spin room, no demiurge can repair the long-term geopolitical damage of a statement like that.
And the tragic, deeply cynical paradox of all this is that the administration's political base at home absolutely loves the performance. Threatening European allies, acting tough on television, and demanding unconditional surrender plays incredibly well to a domestic audience.
But the economic reality oil approaching $100 a barrel, a looming stagflation crisis that destroys working-class savings and a paralyzed government, is creating an unbearable pressure cooker. The performative toughness for the domestic cameras is actively, irreversibly destroying the global security architecture.
So, after analyzing all 7 of these complex hypotheses, we have to synthesize the big picture. What does this all actually mean for you, the listener, and how does this chaotic puzzle eventually resolve?
Bringing it all together, the most vital takeaway from Darwinian's Red Team document is that the price you pay at the gas pump tomorrow morning, the stability of the supply chains that stock your grocery store, and the deployment of massive global militaries are currently being dictated by multiple institutions that are all prioritizing their own short-term survival over any coherent, stabilizing global strategy.
It truly is Thucydides without Pericles, power without wisdom. The demand for unconditional surrender is the ultimate trap, and the U.S. built it entirely for itself. By publicly demanding an outcome from Iran that is mathematically impossible to achieve before their own thawed interceptor stockpiles run completely dry in 30 days, and by assassinating the only man in Iran who possessed the religious authority to order the military to accept a ceasefire, the U.S. has painted itself into a devastating corner.
Exiting the war now looks like a humiliating defeat. But staying in the war mathematically bankrupts their global deterrence and leaves them utterly vulnerable in the Pacific. Which brings us to a final, deeply provocative thought to leave you with.
This is a possibility drawn straight from the nuanced details of Darwinian's framework, and it highlights the ultimate danger of improvising a war. The document notes that right now, while the bombs are falling on Tehran, the Iranian Assembly of Experts is frantically trying to convene in secret.
Their constitutional duty is to choose a new supreme leader to replace the assassinated Khamenei.
The terrifying extrapolation here is this. If the hardline generals of the IRGC leverage this wartime emergency to completely bypass the civilian moderates, if they use the chaos and the patriotic fervor of defending the homeland to install a hardline military puppet, perhaps even Khamenei's wounded son, Mojtaba, who has deep ties to the security apparatus, then America's Operation Epic Fury will have achieved the exact opposite of its assumed goal.
Instead of dismantling the regime and bringing stability to the region, the U.S. military campaign will have permanently enshrined an untouchable, proxy-driven, heavily militarized Iranian state, and that new regime will be fortified, unified, and legitimized by the very chaos that was meant to destroy it. It is a stark, chilling reminder that in a world without grand designs, impulsive actions still have permanent historical consequences.
That is certainly something for you to keep a very close eye on in the weeks ahead, as this unprecedented conflict continues to unfold.
We will keep monitoring the situation and bringing you the analysis that cuts through the noise. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.